Welcome to the Stories with Traction podcast. I'm your host, Matt Zaun. Thank you for joining us as we uncover how stories are one of the most important aspects of your business. We'll talk about struggles, victories, and how you can utilize strategic storytelling to inspire those around you to action. Enjoy this episode. Public speaking. Two words that strike horror into most people. People get anxiety. They get flustered when they hear those words. Tell one of your team members that they have to get up in front of people and present to a group of prospects to try to flip them into clients. And more than likely, they may even have trouble sleeping prior to that presentation. Public speaking is so flustering to so many people. But what's interesting is the top of every survey that managers put out, the number one thing that they want their people to be good at is communication, is public speaking, is connecting. And so employers are hungry. They're thirsty for individuals that can actually get up and present. That's why I am excited for today's conversation. Today, I am joined by Brenden Kumarasamy. Brenden Kumarasamy. Boom, I got it. Brenden Kumarasamy, the founder of Master Talk. Brenden helps ambitious executives and coaches become top 1% communicators in their industries. Welcome, Brenden.
Hey, thanks for having me, Matt. Great to be on.
Hopefully I didn't butcher your last name too badly. How are things going in your world?
Life is always incredible, man. How about yourself?
It's going well. It's going well. I was looking to see where you are and if I'll be speaking close to where you are this year. And I noticed you're really northbound. Like you are really northbound. In fact, I was on a trip several years ago with my wife. We were in Lake Placid, which I believe is about 2.5 hours away from you. So it's south from you. And I remember going there and it was -7 degrees. It was the first time I had ever seen -7. You're probably used to that where you are, but I was blown away with how cold it is. So, what's going on in your world? How are things going for you?
Yeah, it's funny because you're based in the US. So for me, I have to translate that in Celsius. But yeah, -7 degrees Fahrenheit is definitely super, super cold. But yeah, absolutely. Things are going great. Had a lot of great client work at the start of the year. This is my first year in entrepreneurship full time, which I'm super excited about as well. Things are going well as well. So yeah.
That's fantastic. So the reason why I wanted to have you on Stories with Traction is one, to cover your story. I think you have an awesome story that I think a lot of people will be interested in. But also when we had talked several months ago, I just felt like it was value packed. You were talking about all kinds of tips, tricks, techniques regarding public speaking that I feel like a lot of people don't recognize. They had never heard of before. And even though a lot of in-person events aren't completely back across the globe, people more than ever are doing Zoom calls, which you need public speaking skills to really have a riveting Zoom call. I would actually argue you need even more public speaking skills to capture an audience's attention on Zoom. So whether it's in person or Zoom, people need what you're offering more than ever before. So I want to dive in and talk about public speaking from your perspective. Now, before we dive into the nuts and bolts of public speaking, I do want you to highlight a little bit about your background. I was fascinated when you were talking about competitions several months ago, getting into the world through competitive speaking. So can you talk a little bit about that, how you were introduced to public speaking, what competitive speaking even is?
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to, man. So when I was in university, I used to do these things called case competitions. And for those who don't know, case competitions is kind of like professional sports, but for nerds. So while other guys my age were playing footy or basketball or baseball, well, I was not really into any of those things. So what I did instead is I did presentations competitively, to your point. And the main reason I did them was because a lot of big companies like IBM, McKinsey, BCG, Deloitte, a lot of these companies are hiring students straight out of those competitions. And that was my initial goal, was never really to be an entrepreneur. It was to be a corporate executive in a Fortune 500. So I did a lot of these competitions, but I accidentally got really good at coaching other people on how to speak because as I was maturing through the program, man, there's a lot of students who were entering the program and we didn't have a speech coach for those people because we couldn't afford one. And that's how I learned the gift of coaching other people on to speak, and what led to Master Talk eventually when I started my corporate career at IBM a few years ago.
So you're in school, there's different programs for competitive speaking. And at the time, I know you had said that maybe one day you can land a job doing this, but were you good at public speaking when you first set foot into those competitive events, or were you struggling and you wanted to be better?
Definitely. So I definitely struggled my whole life with communication in general. So when I was 5 years old, Matt, I grew up in Montreal, to your point. And for those who don't know, in Montreal, you need to know how to speak French, which is a language I did not know. But despite that, my parents sent me to a French education system to learn the language, which of course I'm super grateful for today. But the journey wasn't super easy, because every time I went to give a presentation, not only was I stressed out about it, like most of us are, I had to present in a language I didn't even know. So I would look at the crowd and go, bonjour. And that was my life for most of it. But when I got to university, because I went to English university, I switched to languages. When I got to upper education, I was comfortable with communication, but I definitely wasn't as polished as I am today. And it was through those reps and repetitions that I got really good at communication later on.
Wow. So, all right. So that's fascinating to me, because I feel like if you're speaking a language that you're not able to connect with others, to me, that sounds really embarrassing. Like you're up there on stage, you're trying to connect, you're fumbling over your words. I can't even imagine that. I often, when we're struggling for different words, or we're in very embarrassing situations, we cave, we want to run off stage, we don't flock to the stage. So I'm interested to talk a little bit more about that. So do you think that with the reps of embarrassment, stretching yourself, pushing yourself, that actually helped mentally? Because once you got over that block, it's almost everything's downhill from there once you're able to connect with the language, right?
Very well said. Definitely, I went through the worst of my public speaking career in my tens rather than, where I am at currently. And I, this is what I tell clients all the time, man. Always do the harder thing. If you're always doing the harder thing with communication, which comes to a lot of the tactics we'll be covering today, when you go back into the boardroom or the entrepreneurship world, based on who you are, life becomes a lot easier. So definitely, because I presented in French my whole life, when I started presenting in English, I was like, oh my God, I get to present a language that it's my first language. It's going to be easy. So yeah, there's definitely a lot of momentum there.
Interesting. Yeah. So I did improv comedy for 4 years, which to people listening, they may be fascinated by that, because I'm not the humorous person in the world. I'm not the funniest, but I did it to put myself in embarrassing situations. And there were numerous times where I'd be under the lights, there's hundreds of people in the audience, and they throw out a suggestion that I have no idea what they're asking for. And I'm putting myself in those embarrassing situations. So back to your point, then I end up going into a company doing a workshop for 20, 30 people, and it's a cakewalk, because one, I know the structure of the workshop. I'm not thrown off by the spontaneous suggestions like an improv. So it's interesting to hear you talk about the embarrassment factor, because oftentimes people, again, they run away from it, but if they embrace it as part of their public speaking journey, it's going to pay off in huge dividends to them in the future, for sure. So I appreciate you mentioning that, Brendan. All right, so you're in this competitive competition with public speaking. You realize that there's really not a lot of help from a speaking coach perspective. So then you dive in and you start helping a lot of these contestants out for these talks. How did you get to that point? Were you doing in-depth studying regarding communication, public speaking? Was it basically trial and error? And now because you learned, X, Y, and Z, you can help others? Take me through that portion, that period of your journey.
Absolutely, man. And by the way, side note, I think it's super cool that you did improv comedy for 4 years. There's a lot more practicality of communication that you learn in that sport than in the boardroom, because in improv, as you know, you get put in situations where you're not even given like any context whatsoever. You just get an apple, make a scene out of it. And you're just like, okay. So I love that, and I did a couple of sessions myself. Definitely not as much of an expert as you though. So I'm sure there's a lot we can learn there. But yeah, man, to your point, after I started gaining a lot more traction in communication, the way that I actually learned it, I always tell people this all the time. I'm 100% practitioner. So my degree in university was not in communication. I did go to business school, but it was in accounting. So completely left field from what I do today. So most of it, all of it was trial and error. But I would say the magic of that, because I didn't learn under any other speech coach, because I couldn't afford one, frankly. My parents were on minimum wage salaries, and I was barely putting my way through university myself. The best part of that was I had a lot of, how do I say this? I had a lot of uh, denial. Like I didn't know what was out there. I was ignorant. That's the word I was looking for. I was completely ignorant to what the frameworks that are out there. So I was creating my own. At some point I was comparing garlic bread to storytelling. I was just completely a mess, making mistakes, learning. But it was through those repetitions that I was able to create my own style of coaching that eventually ended up being the YouTube channel later on.
Okay. All right. So one of the things that I'm fascinated by what you said is that you studied accounting. And I am interested in that because when I go and I speak to accountants or engineers, a lot of them are very data driven. They want the facts, the statistics, the numbers, and I'm a storyteller, right? My whole workshop is on strategic storytelling, which it's very interactive. There's a dynamic element to it. So when I hear people that they have studied drama or political science or communication or sales or marketing, they're all about it. They're ready to embrace it and gobble it up. And I feel like the accounting engineering mindset world, when I go in, I need to be cognizant that we have to talk about data and how you could back that data with storytelling. And I feel like there's different brains at work. So I love that you said that, because that screams to me and proves to me that anyone can get great at public speaking, communication. I feel like if you got great at it, anyone can. And that's not a knock to you. It's just, it's the you're into data, you're into the numbers, you show me the money, right? Show me the statistics, but then how to back that through story. So when you are working with engineers or you're working with people they're highly data driven, how do you convince them, persuade them that there needs to be some type of messaging behind it, some type of storytelling behind it?
Wow, that was a super powerful question, Matt. I've guessed on a lot of podcasts and no one has highlighted that. And that's a lesson for me too. I should probably emphasize the fact in my storytelling, since you're the storytelling master, that I was an accountant. I feel it adds more flavor to when I talk about my story. So thanks for that. It's really good. And that's my takeaway from the pod. But yes, to your point, engineers, accountants are very data driven. So whenever they're speaking, they don't have the empathetic side. Not that they're not empathetic, but they don't go back to, is this actually relevant to a non-technical person? Or how can this be relevant? And I would say for me, the easiest way to bridge those two worlds is really through, why should this matter to the everyday person? Right? Or so what, as we say in the case competition world. So let's say an engineer comes up to us and says, I've coded all of this code. And then you go, so what? Like, what's the relevancy for someone who doesn't understand your tech stack? Or if we're talking to an accountant and they're going through ASPE and GAAP and IFRS, and people are listening to this like, I have no idea what this is, right? That's the point. So they're going through all these numbers and I go, okay, why does this matter to Joe's Bakery if Joe doesn't know a thing about numbers? Why is this important for Joe, who hates math? So we need to be able to bridge those two worlds. And the best way that we bridge those two worlds is to force those data-driven individuals to have dinners, like actual dinners, with the people that they're trying to serve. So when they're having those intimate conversations with people who are not in the world, they start to realize really quickly that the languaging that they're using is not actually landing on their core audience.
That's a really, really good point. So while you're speaking, a very relevant and real example popped in my head. So a couple months ago, I was working with a group of people out in Tennessee, and I was working with a gentleman, and he was talking about a new software initiative in his company. So he was going to be presenting to the company, we're rolling out a whole new software process, a new HR software, a new CRM. They're going to implement all this stuff. And he was going off on and on about all the bells and whistles regarding the software, how awesome it is, how, it's 10% higher, X, Y, and Z, all these numbers. I didn't even understand what he was saying, but basically he was really excited about the numbers and data, and they did all this research and we have to implement it. And I said, do you think your team is going to be excited about all the numbers that you mentioned to me? I said, oh yeah, they're going to get really, really excited. Really? So we dove into that a little bit more about, well, what happens if they're not excited and you did all this work? And I expressed him exactly what you did, so what, right? What is in it for other people? And then the more we talked, he got concerned. Okay, there might be pushback. Okay, there's probably going to be a lot of pushback because it's changed. People are going to have to learn new systems. And they were concerned, we're investing a lot of money into revamping all the software in our company. How do I persuade buy-in? So I simply asked him, what are you excited about most in life? And what are you fearful about most in life? And what he was excited about the most was spending time with his family. And what he was the most afraid of was missing out on different experiences with his family. So his, daughter has a dance recital, missing out on that. His son has a soccer game, he misses out on that. And I said, do you think people in your company have the same fears, the same excitement? And it's like, yes. So right now there's a lot of challenges winning the talent war, really retaining top talent. And he said his people have asked to take more time than he's ever been asked for paid time off before due to different things. And I said, well, what happens when you go in and you present the case that the reason why you're implementing the software is because it is going to radically shift the timing, that you're going to be able to allow the employees to enjoy life more with what they want to do. And this whole story was exactly what you said. We shifted away from data and we really focused on, now they can get off at 5 o'clock on the dot. They can make sure that they have that time with their family. And it was awesome. So it was really moving away from the numbers and moving to that story, but backed by those numbers. So I appreciate you mentioning that. I think that's an extremely valuable point.
And I'd love to double tap on that. Such a great example, Matt. I completely agree. I'm always learning from you as you're asking me questions. I feel I'm the student here at the room, which is amazing. And what I love about you, especially that story you just told, is another angle that people can take is just sitting down with the people you want to serve and just asking them a simple question that nobody does, right? What matters to you most and why? What matters to you most and why? What matters to you most and why? It's a simple question, right? Similar to the two questions you had. What are you the most excited about? What are you the most fearful of? And then you could add this third one as well. So when you ask those questions, you're shocked by the answers because you go, what I value is not what they value. So how about we adapt to them? Because what the world-class communicators do is they adapt to other people's communication style. Whereas what average speakers do is they expect everyone else to adapt to them. Wrong approach. Always take the initiative and be proactive to communicate based on everyone else's needs besides or versus our own.
All right. So there's a lot to unpack with that. Adapting to the audience and not to our own. I think that takes a ton of the anxiety away. And here's why. More than not, when I ask a company or an organization that I go into to speak to, I ask them, what is your expectation? What do you want out of it? What do you want your people to still be implementing 2 years after I leave? And typically the response is way, way, way less than I had thought. So in my mind, I build it up where, oh, they're going to want this and this and this and this and this. And then they'll say something to me like unbelievably simple. And I'll say to them, wait a second. So if I come in and that expectation's met, you consider that a win? Oh yeah. It would change everything for us. Talk about the weight being lifted and anxiety going down. Oftentimes people build up in their mind that they have to do some type of grandiose performance, like a Broadway play or a movie production. They need to razzle and dazzle the audience. But back to your point, the audience might not be asking for that. They might just be asking for them to solve a very specific problem. So I appreciate you mentioning that. So what's the best way to do that? Just simply ask them. I know you had said dinners. Do you send out surveys? What are some of the things that you recommend a manager of a company to do in order to make sure that they are on board with their team?
Absolutely. Great question, man. I would say every speech coach and professional has their own opinion. So I'm sure your perspective is just as important as mine is here. But for me, I'm a big fan of non-data driven approaches. Surveys are great, really gives us insight, and there's nothing wrong with that. But I feel what's really missing in corporate is the human to human interaction. And I know it's been hard in the last couple of years with COVID, but even if it's this virtual Zoom call, I really feel asking those questions in an intimate setting where work is not important, where that's not a part of the agenda, will get you so many more insights rather than just a simple survey. And I can give examples of questions that I tell other people to ask. Some examples include, if you were to explain my idea to somebody else, how would you explain it? That's one you could use. If you were in my shoes, how would you communicate my own idea back to me? If you were excited about this idea, who else should I be talking to elaborate more, to discuss more? Who do you think is a great fit for this idea? Those are just a couple of examples, and I'll throw another one too. From your perspective, how can I communicate my ideas better? So when we start asking questions like this, and once again, they don't have to be worded exactly the way I say them, but just the effort of asking those questions will help your team open up from a human perspective, and then they start talking. But the other piece that's important is when they're talking, be sure that as the lead, you're paying attention, you're taking notes. I take notes all the time on what people are saying, and it's those insights that spark light bulbs in my head on how I can structure my programs better, my services, or the way that I share ideas on a podcast / YouTube channel. It comes from those insights and those interactions.
Yeah, it's a really good point. I appreciate, the listening, the note taking, asking those questions. It's amazing what we can get back just from asking those simple questions. There are a lot of times I'll go and do something, and what I think is not the best part of what I'm presenting is actually the part that people enjoy the most. So that's always really good to pay attention to expand on that. So what are some immediate things that people can do? There's a lot of people listening to this right now saying, I didn't do competitive speaking when I was in school. I don't have the ability to go out and embarrass myself on a regular basis, doing improv comedy, doing stand-up comedy, getting in those types of situations. So what are some practical things that people can do right out of the gate? They're done listening to this podcast episode and they can immediately implement in the days ahead.
Absolutely. I'm happy to give 3 easy tricks, Matt. So the first one is, for every presentation that you give in corporate or just in general to your team, I encourage you to save 10 minutes at the end to just ask them a simple question and do a round table. The question is, what was your biggest takeaway from this presentation? What resonated with you the most? Simple. It's the simple things that help us get the lead. It's just most people don't ask that. So if you ask that question, you're essentially doing what me and Matt just talked about for the last 10, 15 minutes instantaneously in your day-to-day presentations. Because what your takeaway is actually going to be very different from everyone else's saying. So when you hear everyone else's answers, I encourage you to write each of them down, especially if that presentation is really important, like a town hall meeting, where you're giving people status updates about the vision of the company and where we're going. So when you're writing that information down, you're actually simultaneously evaluating what does your team actually care about. And that question is simple to do. That's number 1. Number 2 is structure your presentations like a jigsaw puzzle. I've always believed that public speaking is like a jigsaw puzzle. You know those puzzle pieces we used to do as kids? We used to put them up together. You probably still do them with your kids, man. So the point is when you work on a jigsaw puzzle, it's always important to think about which pieces we start with. And most of us tend to start with the edge pieces because they're easier to find. But we don't do that in public speaking. In public speaking, we do the opposite. We start with the middle first. We shove a bunch of content in our presentations and we ramble throughout the whole thing. So what I encourage people to do is start with the edges first. Practice just your introduction 50 times. I know 50 times sounds like a lot, but 50 times is not that bad because your presentation is like a minute each for your intro. Do the same thing with the conclusion. What's a great movie? The terrible ending. Last time I checked, terrible movie, right? Right. So do the same thing for the close. And after 2 hours of practice, you go, wow, this is like the best intro and close of my life. Now let me tackle the middle. So let me throw it back to you so I'm not monologuing too much, but those are two things that people can do right away.
Yeah, so let's dive a little bit deeper into the jigsaw puzzle approach. All right, so very valid point. So typically we go right after that main part of the picture. You had mentioned rambling on when everyone really knows based on all kinds of feedback, and there's been numerous articles and books written that the opening and closing are the two most important parts because people remember what we say first and what we say last, but yet we spend so little time working on that. So you would prompt your clients to really focus on going repetition over and over and over again, that intro and that conclusion. Are there some ways that they can do that? Do you recommend people just stand up in the comfort of their own home and they just talk like they would be talking? Or do they record it? Do they look in the mirror and watch for bot? How would you recommend people tackle that?
Absolutely. I would say the easiest is really what's easy for people to implement. So generally speaking, where I've seen the most success is when somebody has another accountability partner. So I'll give you the best example of this in corporate. Let's say 4 people are on the same team, Matt. They're proposing for an RFP, a sales call with a client or a potential one. This is a great way to practice. So with that team that you already have established in the workplace, instead of practicing the presentation over and over and over again, top to bottom, this is what it mostly happens. We all present for 30 minutes and then 30 minutes and then 30 minutes and then 30 minutes. And then everyone's tired and they don't see any progress and everyone gets lunch. So instead, what you want to do is say, okay, John is presenting the first minute. John, let's have you present that 1 minute 10 times. So then John does it once. Oh, actually, John, change this. And then John does this, doom, doom, doom. And after 10 times, his intro is perfect. Then everyone says, okay, now we have momentum. Now, Julia, do the close. So the trick is to practice heavy repetition in small increments. So heavy repetition in small increments. And that's how you build momentum really quickly, especially in a group-related presentation.
That's an awesome point. All right, so really focus on that repetition, the most important parts, and really chunk it. So you're focusing on different elements of that talk, of that workshop, keynote, presentation, whatever people are working on, really focusing in on those. So one of the things that's happened in the last 2 years is obviously a lot of people have gone to virtual meetings. And one of the things that I hear as a reoccurring theme from people is they're bored. Right? They're zoomed out. They don't want to do virtual meetings. They don't want to do it. And I would really have to push back on those people. And the reason, because I feel like a lot of it comes down to the way people are presenting. If they're on Zoom calls that are just the same day in and day out, and there's really no different flavor, of course they're going to get bored. We get bored about anything in life. You go to the gym every single day. If you're doing the same thing over and over again, you're going to get bored. If you watch the same movie over again, you're going to get bored. And we've been doing that as a society now for the last 2 years. So based on what you said about the opening and closing, would you say that it's different presenting virtually versus in person, or do you think it's primarily stayed the same? We're just looking at a camera versus into people's eyeballs. What would you say regarding virtual versus in person?
I'm sure we have similar opinions on this, Matt, but definitely virtual is a very different sport than in person. Even if there's a lot of similarities, there are definitely some key differences I'd love to point out. So the first one is eye contact. So when you're in the real world, you're splitting your eye contact in between different people in the audience. So for those of you who are listening to this podcast, which is audio based, you won't notice me just moving my head around and just looking at people. So just imagine yourself in a room in person. Whereas when you're virtual, your eye contact is actually a lot easier because whether you're speaking to one person or 1,000, you just have to look in one spot, which is the camera, and you'll look at everyone at the same time. So that's the first key difference. The second key difference is energy. I don't know about people who are listening to this, but definitely for me, it's so much easier for me to bring my energy because in person specifically, because I can see the people, I can shake their hand, I can give them a hug, I can get to know them, and I'm also more accountable. So if I wake up 5 a.m. in the morning for a speech that I have to give virtually, it's kind of like, well, I guess I could be in my pajamas. Well, I guess I could, put a nice shirt on, no one really know. But when you're in person, it's like, no, I got to take a shower. I got to be ready. I got to be poised. I got to make sure my tie is well thought out and everything. So there's a lot more accountability and energy in person. And the third piece as well is it's a lot easier to get to know your audience in person because you could have dinner with them or lunch or breakfast right after the presentation is over, which is way harder to replicate virtually. But having said that, you can still get better virtually. I would say the best way to do that is to get better in person, like do presentations with small groups now that COVID is slowly dwindling down, and bring that energy back to your virtual presentations.
Great point. And the reason why I asked that and I mentioned it is because to tie back into your point about focusing on the edges of those puzzle pieces, going through the intro and the closing, I feel like a lot of times people might not understand the importance of that, doing that from a virtual perspective. So I think this is extremely important, what Brenden's talking about, because right now you can't see him, you can't see me, but as Brenden's talking, he's using body language. He's speaking with his body. He's doing a lot of the stuff he may be doing in person, and it's captivating. He's not just staring in the camera, just talking monotone. So he's using his body. And I want people to really be cognizant of that in order to grip your audience, even in a virtual format, it is paramount to your success to go through the repetitions of intro and closing, because you don't want people to say, I'm zoomed out after that meeting that you have virtually. You want people to have those takeaways. So I appreciate you mentioning that. So I want to go back to the three things that you had mentioned. We talked about the biggest takeaway people have, asking them, and we also talked about the structure, focusing on those edge pieces. What would be the third point that you would recommend people immediately implement?
Absolutely. So this is an exercise I call the random word exercise. And essentially what the random word exercise is meant is you pick a random word, let's say phone, or headphone, or tissue paper, and you have to present out of thin air. And the reason why this is important, especially for the corporate people, the entrepreneurs who are listening to this, because many of you are probably listening to this exercise and saying, why does this matter? Why does it matter if I can talk about avocados for a minute? The reason it matters is simple, because the worst place to practice your communication skills, in my opinion, is the boardroom. Why? Because every presentation is different. Every presentation is stressful, and every presentation is tied to a punishment if you don't do well. So if you don't present well in corporate, it's not like, oh yeah, Matt or John, you really messed up that sales meeting with the $5 million client. Totally fine, right? So there's huge pressure. And this is why the random word exercise is so effective, because if you can talk about nonsense and still make it sound amazing, when you go back into corporate or in your entrepreneurial journey, your life becomes a lot easier because you already are a subject matter expert in your work, right? It's a lot easier for me to talk about communication, of course, because that's what we do, storytelling for you, strategic storytelling. But if you can talk about avocados, a lot easier for you to do it in person. And I'm also happy to do an example if you want.
All right, that's awesome. So I love the random word exercise. So I do this. I don't do it the way I never thought of it this way about random words. I typically focus on random emotions or random topics that I know will come up with in events that I'm going into. But what I do is I set time aside in my calendar every day. Every day I have a time block in my calendar where, I'll stand up in the comfort of my own home office and I'll just throw something out and then I talk about it. So very similar to what you do. And I can speak to what you're saying. It has been invaluable to me. It has been pure gold, because what it's done is it's spurred on a ton of creativity, the surge of creativity, because I'll pick a topic, I'll start talking about it. I'll uncover things that I didn't really think were there, because a lot of our best stories are trapped in our subconscious mind. And the way we get those out is through different prompts. So I never really thought that would be there. And it actually adds more material to presentations, to workshops, to keynotes that I didn't think were there. So I think that's a fantastic point. So thank you so much for sharing that. All right, so I just want to go through those again. So ask for the biggest takeaway. So something as simple as people, as soon as the meeting's over, they could reach out to someone and say, hey, what was your biggest takeaway? Focusing on those edge pieces, the repetitions with the intro and the closing. I thought that was fantastic. And then also the random word game, and have fun with it, right? Just have some fun, learn, how to present better in the comfort of your own home before you go into the boardroom. So I really appreciate you mentioning that. So one of the things that I really appreciate about what you do is really focusing on, you had mentioned the top 1% communicators. You know, your mission in life is to help ambitious executives and coaches become the top 1%. So we had talked about basics with what you had said. So basics, but there are still really good communicators in, let's say, the top 10%. What would you say separates the top 10% of communicators that are out there and the top 1%? What are some things that you think really separates those two groups?
Love that. To keep things simple, Matt, let's focus on 3 key differences, I would say, between top 1 and 10%. But let's start with the good news. The good news is this. If you do the random word exercise one time, that's great. But if you do the random word exercise hundreds of times, that already puts you in a very good place, especially in corporate, because a lot of senior executives I work with, even at the C-suite level, still make a lot of basic communication mistakes, like filler words, their vocal tone variations, and other tips. So if you just do the 3 tips that we outlined, that will easily put you in the 10% of all communicators in a corporate setting, especially, with some very small exceptions. But I'd say for the most part, that would be the case. But if you want to get into the top 1%, 3 things you want to focus on. One is top 1% communicators have clear direction. Most of us have goals in our businesses, in our careers, in our health, in our romantic lives, but we do not have goals with our communication. So having a clear set of communication goals would be the first step. So you have clear direction on where communication is going to take you in your life. And the best way to do this, I found, when I coach clients on communication goal setting, is specifically choosing 3 speakers that you want to become yourself, that where you really appreciate their styles. And they don't have to be people in the boardroom. They could be thought leaders, scientists, comedians, and really analyzing each of their speeches. So it would simply be, you pick 3 speakers, you put 1 strength that you really appreciate about them as a speaker, 1 weakness that you feel that they have, to humanize them, to make you believe that you can get to their level. And then the third piece is ask yourself, what is 1 speech technique that you want from that individual speaker, and just studying them, investing 30 minutes a week, watching one of their TED Talks, but only watching that TED Talk from the frame of mind of just that 1 speech technique that you want to master. That would be the first piece, is communication goal setting.
Okay, so let's unpack these a little bit, because I think there's a lot that we can draw from here. So you started out by saying, just as someone does the random word exercise hundreds of times, they're going to separate themselves from people that aren't doing that. I think that's a really good point. I was questioning whether I should mention this or not, but sometimes we have to share things that we don't know if we should share. A couple months ago, I was giving a talk and I was throwing out different exercises that I recommended people do. And after this workshop, one of the individuals said to me, I think that the exercises that you recommended are silly and they're a waste of time, and I could tell you I'm not going to do them. Come to find out, this individual reached back out to me and said he did this survey company-wide, and the lowest scores that he got was on communication. His people destroyed him when it came to communication. Some of the comments were very, very negative on how he doesn't know how to connect with his staff. He doesn't know how to communicate, present, and that was the worst. So I mention that because what you're saying matters. Like the random word game, as silly as that may sound to people, imagine just focusing on that once a day. So you had said, setting clear direction with communication, these goals. If people do something as simple as, for 1 minute every single day, the first word that pops into their mind, they're going to talk about it for that minute. Just doing something as simple as that, 1 minute out of their day, a change could have massive ripple effects after they do that for a year or 2. So something as simple as that from that goal, that expectation. I also really appreciate, picking 3 speakers that they want to study and kind of understand the dynamics of that. I want to talk about that a little bit more. So let's talk about executives. So individuals, they're leaders of leaders. They manage people. They really want to create a company culture of communication, connecting, really of persuasion. Would they be studying individuals that they're trying to extract the skill set that they want to have to utilize so they can empower their people? How would they pick these speakers?
Excellent follow-up question, Matt. And the way that we do this is everyone's got their own flavor on this. Some people, when they do communication goal setting, they just pick people they're really inspired by. But I'd say the easiest way to play this is specifically what are your goals and who are the speakers who have already achieved those goals. So super simple example, let's say you're a manager at a company and you want to become that organization's chief operating officer. So COO, for those who don't know, COO is just the CEO's right hand man or woman. So what you want to do is one of the people on your goal sheet should be a COO in an industry that you're in. So if you're in the makeup business, you want to go see who are the COOs in the makeup business who have done an interview on a podcast, who have been on, let's say, like a YouTube video, who have done a keynote, and you want to keep that top of mind. I am shocked, Matt, at how small the percentage is of aspiring executives who do not study C-suite level executive communication, like spending that 30 minutes to go, okay, how does the COO of this company present? Like, it's a simple thing, but most people don't go the extra mile and just say, okay, well, I'll just focus on my next promotion. Whoa, that's not what you should be doing. You have to be focusing on the end goal and how those people are communicating. Because if you speak like a COO at a manager level, your promotions are going to go super, super fast. They're going to skyrocket versus you just trying to communicate for the next position in your company.
It's a really interesting point. So you would have, and I'm sure that's why you ranked them the way you did. So once you set your clear direction with those goals, then you take those goals and you find people that have already attained that skill level, and you do research on them, find out, what makes them tick, how did they do this, so that you can start doing different things regarding what they've done. I'm thinking, for me personally, something that I've struggled with for years, in fact, I still struggle with to this day, is I'm not a naturally funny person. That's why I did improv for 4 years, because I had to bring some type of humor to my talks. I wanted to embarrass myself in those environments, but I wanted to try to figure out, what's the dynamics of humor. So one of the things that I did was I studied Jerry Seinfeld. I did a deep dive into what makes him tick. Why is he really good at observational humor? He's a master at observational humor. He could look at something happening in front of him and he's asking, where's the humor in this? How do I uncover that humor? So I will never be the funniest speaker people have ever heard. I mean, I'm not going to ever attain the achievement of being a comic speaker, but just adding a few laugh lines here and there has been incredible to my speaking journey. And I did exactly what you said. So I just wanted to highlight that, because what you're saying really matters and it can absolutely help people. So let's talk about the third one, before we close out today, about this speech technique. So once they have identified these three individuals, they're highlighting a very specific element of speaking. So would they say, oh, I want to get better at eye contact, or I want to get better at body language, or I want to get better at the structure of my talks. I want to have a lot more structure. Is that what you mean by speech techniques?
Correct. I'm happy to give a very specific example, because this is actually going back to the difference between top 1% and 10%. Even I'm working on this all the time, because my communication goals are always changing and I want to remain at the top 1%, hopefully get to the 0.1% one day. And I'm still work in progress. But one example I can give for my own communication goal sheet is Gary Vaynerchuk, right? For those who know, Gary V, CEO of VaynerMedia, one of the fastest growing marketing agencies in the world. Some people love him, some people hate him. But I'm definitely one of the people who really enjoys communication style. So the one thing I want from Gary is very simple. It's a simplicity. The way he's able to disseminate an idea, despite being the CEO of a $200 million company, he's able to relate to the CEO of Campbell Soups and this 5-year-old, 7-year-old girl who's asking for his autograph because she watched him on TikTok. That is a very powerful skill set. How does this mid 40-year-old man, how is he able to, this Russian guy, how is he able to relate to all spectrums of communication? So I really spend a lot of time studying how he structures ideas so that when I'm on a podcast like this one, I'm very alert to, hey, am I communicating an idea that every single human being can understand? Or am I going too much in the weeds where people are getting lost? So when I started for example, when I started showing up on podcasts and I talked about communication goals, most people would be super lost because most people have never even set a communication goal. So with that in mind, I need to be able to simplify this in a way where people go, okay, I can implement that. So that's one example of how you can focus on how you want to get better as a speaker.
Outstanding point. One thing, because you name dropped Gary Vaynerchuk, I just have to mention, because you did say people love or hate him. I've known a lot of people that have said negative things about him in that hate category. What's interesting to me, though, even if you don't like his communication style based on what you saw of him, so you may have seen a video of him and he came across as abrasive or very intensive, he really knows his audience. And I've seen him speak in a completely different format where he wasn't abrasive. He wasn't using, curse words in his talks, because I think that might be a turnoff to some people. And he was very, very different. And the reason was because he was in front of a completely different audience. And that is a master communicator, understanding the audience they're in front of and adapting. So I really appreciate you mentioning him, because there is that love-hate type flavor he gives off to a lot of people, but he is really a master at his audience. So before we close out, I want to make sure that people can connect with you based on everything you talked about. We unpacked a lot of stuff. I think you gave a ton of value, and I'm so happy and appreciative of that. So if someone wants to reach out to you for speech coaching, for help with presentations, public speaking, what is the best place that they can connect with you, Brendan?
Yeah, absolutely, man. So 2 easy ways, and thanks for the conversation. This is awesome. The first way is definitely the YouTube channel. If you just type Master Talk in one word on the YouTube search engine, you'll find me. There's a lot of free videos that you can check out to learn about your communication skills. And for those of you who want to attend one of my free training seminars, I do one every 2 weeks over Zoom. You can register for that for free at rockstarcommunicator.com, and I coach people for free on that call.
Great. All right. So rockstarcommunicator.com and the YouTube channel, which is Master Talk. What I will do to make it extremely convenient for everyone is I will put those in the show notes. People could just click from the show notes, go right to those different places, the YouTube and the website. So thank you so much for your time. I'm literally looking here. I have 4 pages of notes based on what you said. I'm excited to go revamp my public speaking style as well. I think we can all learn so much. So I'm actually looking at all these notes I have here, and it's going to be awesome in the days ahead, because it's going to be so good, not only to people listening, but also myself. So thank you again for your time. I very much appreciate it.
Likewise, brother.
Thank you for listening to the Stories with Traction podcast. If you have a story that you would like to share, feel free to drop an email to matt@mattzaun.com with the subject line Stories with Traction. Also, feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn, where I share tons of resources on how you can be a better storyteller. Remember, if you want to persuade with power and inspire those around you to action, you must share more stories.